Hello, I'm Adrian Finnegan, and this is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, it faces serious economic challenges and a trade dispute with the US. Yet China's top leaders have cast the nation as a model of stability. But is it? And will their plans to revive growth work? Rearming Europe, the EU wants to spend big to fund its own security. But how will the plan be financed? And can the continent become completely independent of US military support? And Donald Trump has established a strategic Bitcoin reserve and a crypto stockpile. Why did the president set them up? And how will that affect the industry? Confidence in the economy and projecting China as a stable global player despite serious economic problems. That's the message delivered by the nation's top leaders during the National People's Congress. It was aimed at the Chinese people and politicians in the US. Beijing is asking consumers to spend to hit an ambitious growth target of 5% and telling the US it's no longer relying on exports to power its slowing economy as a trade war with Washington escalates. China's leaders also aim to transform the nation into a technological superpower to rival the US. They're pumping in billions of dollars to revive economic growth. But how far will they go? We'll discuss that with our guests shortly. But first, Katrina Yu reports from Beijing.
In China, gold is a symbol of good fortune, and jewelry like this, a popular gift for loved ones. But in recent months, more and more shoppers have been buying gold for themselves, seeing it as a good investment.
Gold is better than putting money in savings, and it looks better. The price may also go up.
Gold prices hit a record high this year, stoked by fears about the health of China's economy and increasing global tensions. Buyers consider it a safe haven compared to other, more volatile assets. The rush to buy gold reflects the uncertainty around China's economic future. Growth is slowing, and other forms of investment, such as real estate or the stock market, are considered unreliable. It's this negative sentiment that Chinese leaders desperately want to turn around. At the two sessions meetings in Beijing, officials from the country's top economic agencies projected confidence in the country's future.
Our system has advantages, our market holds great potential, and our enterprises are full of vitality.
Those challenges include an extra 10% tariff on Chinese goods imposed by the Trump administration in March, bringing total new duties to 20% this year. China hit back with its own levy of 10 to 15% on American agricultural products and investment and trade restrictions for 25 US companies.
China's probably going to have somewhat of a growth shock from the tariffs. It's very hard to estimate exactly how large that will be.
The Chinese government, however, has downplayed concerns and says it will meet its 5% GDP target for the year, in part by ramping up domestic consumption and investing more in the private sector. A so-called National Venture Capital Guidance Fund will be issued with $138 billion to support technology startups.
That's a structural change that the private sector, like companies like Alibaba and a whole lot of other very large companies, will get more state support and will be integrated more deeply into the way in which the Chinese economy is planning.
Beijing will prioritize what it says are industries of the future. Officials say homegrown AI chatbot DeepSeek has highlighted China's capacity for innovation. Still, the possibility of more US tariffs threatens to derail growth, something Beijing says it's prepared for.
To cope with uncertainties, the central government has set aside ample reserve tools and policy space.
For now, many in China are hoping for more stability. Until then, the allure of gold will be hard to resist. Katrina Yu, Al Jazeera for Counting the Cost, Beijing.
Bin Shu is Professor of Economics and Finance at the China-Europe International Business School. He joins us now from Shanghai. Professor, good to have you with us. Long gone are the heady days of plus 10% growth. Is 5% growth this year a realistic target, given all that's going on?
I think this is a good choice because 5% is not too high so that it is achievable, while 5% is not easy to achieve. So it will require a lot of efforts, both from Chinese government and the private sector. So that is set as a guiding goal for the Chinese economy, which I think it's appropriate.
But what about the level of stimulus? Is that going to be enough to increase consumer confidence and get people to spend again?
Yes, I mean, Chinese economy is now in a deflationary situation, and the CPI inflation was below 0% last month. So there's a lot of stimulus that would be needed to make Chinese people spend again. So the government has made its effort in increasing the government debt deficit to GDP ratio from 3% to 4%, and also are considering reducing interest rates and so on. But in my assessment, those stimulus policies are not going to be enough, to make Chinese people to open their wallet to consume again. It would require a lot more, effort, not just in terms of monetary stimulus, but in terms of recovering the confidence of Chinese people towards the future.
And given all that's going on economically, globally right now, what's more important for the Chinese government, growth or stability? Can it have both?
Unfortunately, China cannot have both stability and growth. So I think the government is really carefully trading these two off. But in my understanding, the Chinese government will always put stability ahead of growth. Okay, the government recognizes that the Chinese economy has entered a new period, and so it's not really healthy to have a very high growth rate, but you do need to maintain a moderately high growth rate in order to have these young people employed. So I guess the government is trying hard to get 5% growth, and while maintaining the stability of the society. So it is really a difficult situation for China, but that's the only choice the government will adopt.
China's putting on a brave face in response to Donald Trump's tariffs, saying that, OK, we're not going to place such a great emphasis on exports to the US. We can do without them. But just how damaging will Trump's tariffs be to the Chinese economy? Could it have a positive effect in that it would make perhaps China great again rather than making America great again, as the US president hopes?
Yes, I think Trump has been doing what Trump does, and that is really to have very aggressive policies against all countries, including China. So this time, I think China is adopting a different approach. Unlike the first time when Trump was in his first presidency, and China was adopting tit-for-tat, retaliation. However, I think the Chinese government has learned a lesson from the early encounter with Trump. Therefore, this time it is going to loudly protest U.S. tariff. However, in terms of retaliation, China will do it in a nominal way, just finding some selected targets, such as agriculture, to show that China will fight back. I think Trump may be a good news for China, which is that the Chinese economy is entering a new period, and it requires a lot more self-innovation. So I think the positive effect from this external pressure is really serving China good, and in Trump's words, maybe making China great again. And that is an effect that is not expected by Donald Trump, but I see it is happening.
Professor, it's been really good to talk to you on Counting the Cost. Many thanks indeed for being with us, sir.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, to something that we've been talking about on Counting the Cost for several weeks. Economists say that the emergence of China as a tech leader, a global trade war, and European plans to spend big on defence could threaten so-called US exceptionalism. What does that term actually mean, though? Well, American exceptionalism refers to the nation's outperformance in the global economy. For years, the US has powered ahead of other nations in economic growth, stock prices, artificial intelligence, and in other areas. But economic data suggests the economy is losing steam, and fears over a recession are growing. Even President Trump has refused to rule one out. Surveys show that businesses are concerned about tariff uncertainty, and manufacturers are reporting steep declines in new orders. Consumer confidence has plunged, and spending declined in January for the first time in nearly 2 years. The labour market slowed last month, creating fewer jobs than expected. And the US dollar dropped to multi-month lows against the euro and yen last week. Trump's tariffs and fears over a slowing economy have spooked investors. Stocks are down so far this year, with money flowing into Europe and China as investors diversify away from the US market. Canada's next Prime Minister, Mark Carney, has vowed to win the trade war with Trump. Former central banker Carney will become PM after the governing Liberal Party elected him its leader in a landslide vote. In his victory speech, he focused on what he called Trump's unjustified tariffs on Canada. The two nations have exchanged back and forth announcements on tit-for-tat tariffs. The European Union has long seen itself as a project built for peace and open trade. Today, spooked by President Donald Trump's statements, it's rushing to rearm. Trump has pressured Europe to spend more on its own defence and suggested that the US might not protect NATO members that he believes aren't paying enough into the alliance. With transatlantic relations in question, the EU is scrambling to boost its defensive capabilities. It now plans to spend big, potentially ramping up defence spending by more than $860 billion, including a loan programme to pay for more arms and technology. Michael Apple reports.
Europe says it's officially entering an age of rearmament. Its leaders acknowledge that decades of underinvestment in defense have caught up with it. Donald Trump's America First agenda and shift in policy towards Russia mean the US is no longer the guarantor of security in Europe.
You don't have the cards right now.
The Ukrainian leader's disastrous meeting at the White House prompted action from Brussels.
Europe is ready to assume its responsibilities. Rearm Europe could mobilize close to 800 billion euros of defense expenditures.
When Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine began in 2022, Europe was spending nearly $150 billion on defense. By 2024, that expenditure had more than doubled to $355 billion. Europe's new rearmament drive aims to free up $860 billion over the next 4 years, with $160 billion of that funding missile and drone defences through loans. To achieve this target, EU budget restrictions have been relaxed, allowing member states to boost defence spending by an additional 1.5% of GDP on average. President Emmanuel Macron says France and the EU plan to add tens of billions of dollars to the pot using Russia's own finances.
In
2025, the EU will provide $33 billion as part of the Ukraine facility and the G7's Extraordinary Revenue Acceleration Initiative, funded by the interest generated by seized Russian assets.
Germany's incoming chancellor plans to unlock billions in defense and infrastructure by relaxing borrowing limits, known as the debt brake. But he's facing domestic opposition. Europe is scrambling to wean itself off its decades-long dependence on US military might. Staring at the reality its defenses may be its responsibility alone in the near future. Michael Apple, Al Jazeera, for Counting the Cost.
Stuart Dee is research leader in defence, security and justice at the RAND Europe think tank. His primary focus is on defence, economics and acquisition across major European and UK programmes. He joins us now from London. Good to have you with us, Stuart. Can Europe wean itself off decades of US military support? To what extent has it taken that support for granted?
Yeah, it's an interesting context that we find ourselves in. As you rightly identify, Europe is effectively moving against a very long-term trend in relatively low levels of defence investment. I think what's interesting to see is the differing approaches that we're seeing to it. So in effect, as you identified in the video a moment ago, the Rearm Europe package is, for all intents and purposes, hypothetical mobilization of capital up to 800 billion euros is the big number that's put on it. It's got two audiences for all intents and purposes. It's partly about deterrence, so it's partly about positioning in the direction of adversaries, that we've got this capacity to turn on significant pools of industrial capability and underlying technology. But at the same time, it's clearly directed in the direction of NATO allies, primarily the US, and saying, look, the European Union and the European member states are really stepping up in terms of the serious nature of the threat that we perceive that we're facing.
But it's not going to be easy, is it? What are the logistical challenges here? Europe is not the US. It's a bloc of independent states, all with their own defence budgets and defence policies.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's historically a fragmented market, which really inhibits the ability of defence primes and defence players in the sector to generate scale and generate the strong levels of commercial success that you've traditionally seen the US primes develop. There are a number of underlying challenges. I think partly on the part of European leaders, they'll be hoping that the really strong large number and the really strong commitment that we're sending will effectively be a signal into the underlying supply chain that it's time to start investing and that this is a real serious pivot. I think at the same time, one of the real key challenges underlying all of this will be the availability of people and skilled people, and the willingness to come and work in the defence sector is one of the real historic underlying challenges, particularly in Europe. I think at the same time, one of the other big challenges that states will be really looking at is that historically defence doesn't have a fantastic track record in terms of seeing cash going into the system, smoothly going through that procurement system and coming out in terms of good value for money products at the other end. So it's a slow and complex procurement system.
So what are the challenges in terms of policy then? Will there be mandatory defence spending requirements? Will EU states be required to relinquish their autonomy over defence spending and policy? How will these loans work?
I think that all of these challenges together are the things that they're going to be looking at really quickly. So we see already the 150 billion euro part of the loan facility that the European Commission have come out with. We're already starting to see some of these debates washing through. So will that include non-core EU members, such as the UK? I'm sat in London right now as I'm saying this. That's a debate that's already starting to play out. At the same time, one of the really big inhibitors that we see sitting behind this is the willingness of private capital to get behind this whole push. And what we've seen historically is a slightly fragmented policy landscape in that space. So we've seen differing levels of policy across the EU for that enable the ease of investment into the sector. But as you rightly identify, I think that the biggest challenge for this is historically European states have looked at managing this divide between managing unit cost in defence on one hand, which you primarily do by buying off the shelf, and traditionally that has meant buying American, versus retaining the economic and industrial benefit that comes from defence on one side, which inevitably leads to higher costs. I think that what we see...
Sorry to interrupt, Stuart. One final question. Will increased defence spending across the bloc actually help or hinder economic growth? I'm thinking especially of the smaller states and these loans which are going to encourage them to get further into debt.
Yes, I think this is one of frankly, the jury is really out from an economic perspective on the extent to which defence drives growth in real terms. What we do see is really good evidence that defence drives very high quality jobs, and it drives industrial innovation, it sustains supply chains. That is absolutely for sure. I think where the pure economic debate sits is this real growth, or is this just, as you identify, just adding to the government's tab and sustaining some of these technologies at cost? I think in order to see real economic growth, what governments will be hoping to see is that there's some spin across innovation and some spin across economic benefit into adjacent sectors, such as the aerospace sector, which can benefit from some of these really long-term investments in combat air, for example.
Really good to talk to you, Stuart. Many thanks indeed for being with us.
Thank you.
It will be the first reserve of its kind in the US, estimated to be worth billions of dollars. Donald Trump has signed an executive order to create a national stockpile of Bitcoin and other digital currencies. It'll be funded with tokens that the government has seized in legal cases over the years. The order also calls for plans to buy more Bitcoin, as long as those purchases don't generate extra costs for taxpayers. Bitcoin, the world's largest digital currency, fell by as much as 6% following Trump's order. The president has taken several steps to elevate the volatile sector since taking office in January. Trump has a personal stake in the cryptocurrency industry, and ethics experts are concerned about a possible conflict of interest. Andrew O'Neill is the managing director of and co-chair of S&P Global's Digital Assets Research Lab. He joins us now from London. Good to have you with us, Andrew. How significant would be the establishment of this Bitcoin reserve? Is it anything more than a publicity stunt, or is it actually a pretty good idea?
When we think about the context of this, it's important to think of this in the context of governments running persistent deficits, having increasing national debt, and the potential that through whether that's further pandemics or geopolitical crises, that there could be an acceleration of indebtedness, that there could be debasement of their local fiat currency. And generally, governments hold gold for that purpose, to hedge against that potential risk of debasement of their currency, preserve their assets. Bitcoin has some of the characteristics of gold. It is not controlled by any particular entity. It has a fixed supply. It is also digital and therefore easier to move than gold. However, it obviously has a much shorter track record than gold as a store of value. That said, when we look at these proposals around a Bitcoin strategic reserve, what's happened already in the executive order is that this reserve has been established using Bitcoin already owned by the government. And any additions to that, as you mentioned, will be subject to not incurring additional costs to taxpayers. What that looks like in practice is something that's not yet clear. There's a call for proposals or for recommendations within the next 60 days from that executive order. But the key point here is that the aim of this Bitcoin reserve is to hold the asset for the long term and not to be looking to trade or sell this Bitcoin into the market with a view to making it.
If the US does go ahead with and establish this Bitcoin reserve, would you expect to see other nations following suit? And what does this mean for the cryptocurrency industry?
I think the reaction in terms of market prices was perhaps disappointment that there wasn't a more detailed announcement about the US government purchasing additional Bitcoin and therefore bringing additional buying power into the Bitcoin market. But what's actually happened with this executive order is mainly symbolic, but symbols matter. And so what's happened with this executive order is that the US government has officially now recognized Bitcoin as a reserve asset, and that is going to feed into decision-making in other countries. It is, I guess, quite possible that other countries will look to follow suit. In the long run, I think that is very significant for Bitcoin as an asset itself. Clearly, in the short run, there's been some disappointment that there wasn't further clarity on additional purchases from the government.
Andrew, it's been great to talk to you on Counting the Cost. Many thanks indeed for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, the tiny Himalayan nation of Bhutan is mining Bitcoin to make up for falling tourism revenue. It's using the profits to fund government spending. Bernard Smith has been to the capital to see why cryptocurrency has become such an important part of the economy.
In Bhutan, gold is everywhere, a Buddhist symbol of the everlasting nature of enlightenment. Now this small Himalayan kingdom is investing in a future it hopes will be blessed with what backers call digital gold, Bitcoin. It's also finite and supposedly everlasting.
There are hundreds of people who have made billions of dollars on the back of Bitcoin. Why aren't governments doing more? Even if it seems to be
Prime Minister's chairing Topgay says Bitcoin is a strategic reserve, one currently worth more than $1 billion.
We have used Bitcoin for health, to provide free healthcare, for our environment, but these are minor. The main use of Bitcoin has been to finance the salaries of public servants.
Bhutan has built Bitcoin mines at locations across the country where thousands of energy-hungry computers solve complex mathematical puzzles to claim Bitcoins. And here's what's powering this modern-day gold rush: hydro-generated electricity.
The government says its Bitcoin operation is carbon neutral. It relies only on water from the Himalayas. It's also very profitable, with Bhutan's computers being rewarded with Bitcoins that at current prices add up to millions of dollars a week.
Bhutan has 6 dams and is building more, with plans to increase generating capacity from the current 3,000 megawatts to 15,000 megawatts by 2040. Bhutan is a small country. Large-scale manufacturing and agriculture aren't possible, almost all food is imported, and options for economic development are limited.
I would be very worried if our government was buying Bitcoin, in trading in Bitcoin, but I think the kind of reassurance for us Bhutanese citizens is that the government is mining it. We are using the cheap hydropower, and instead of exporting it at a very cheap rate, we are using it to mine Bitcoins in the high mountains of Bhutan.
Whatever I require for the chief executive of Bhutan's sovereign holding company says exploiting Bitcoin and other new technologies is vital to economic development.
I think you cannot run away from blockchain, cannot run away from AI, how blockchain and AI will combine the industry of money, if I may say, and how money flows from one hand to another, because it's one of the biggest innovation in the space of money for humanity from the time we remember where money was discovered or invented.
Will the Bhutanese be one day making Bitcoin offerings to Buddha? The Prime Minister thinks it could happen.
We have our own tender here, Niltram. Our reserves also are in many international currencies, and sooner or later I'm sure Bitcoin will also feature. Depends on how ready the world is. We are moving in that direction, aren't we?
The US has moved in that direction, last week creating a strategic Bitcoin reserve. Bernard Smith, Al Jazeera, for Counting the Cost, Thimphu, Bhutan.
And that's our show for this week. If you'd like to comment on anything that you've seen, I'm at @afinnegan on X. Remember to use the hashtag AJCTC, please, or you can drop us a line. Countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our email address. As always, there's plenty more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That takes you straight to our page, and there you'll find individual reports, links, and entire editions for you to catch up on. But that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Adrian Finnegan from the team here in Doha. Thanks for being with us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.